Have you ever just looked around at the world today and felt like something is, well, fundamentally broken? We're going to go beyond just the headlines and the symptoms to really explore the hidden forces that are shaping our societies. We're on a search for the unseen roots of our biggest cultural challenges.
So let's start with a pretty stark reality. If you look at developed nations, South Korea has one of the highest suicide rates. And look, this isn't just a statistic on a chart, it's a national tragedy, and it's a huge red flag that there's something much deeper going on within the culture.
So you have to ask, what's really wrong with this picture? I mean, when you put that statistic alongside things like plummeting birth rates and sky-high rates of depression, you start to see a pattern, right? These aren't just separate, isolated problems. They're symptoms of a much larger crisis that we can't always see on the surface.
To really get our heads around this, let's use a metaphor that makes a ton of sense. A tree. The things we see in society, the economy, mental health, family stability, that's all the fruit. But that fruit doesn't just appear out of nowhere. It grows directly from a culture's deepest beliefs and values. Those are the roots.
And here's exactly how it all connects. It starts with our core beliefs, the roots. Those beliefs then drive our collective behavior. And that behavior is what produces the results we see, the fruit. So if you want to change the fruit, if you want a healthier society, you can't just tape better apples to the branches. You have to go all the way down and examine the roots.
So here's our game plan for digging into this. First, we're going to look at what's called a war of ideas. Then we'll explore 3 stories, 1 world, to see the big narratives competing for our attention. After that, we'll dive into the story that transforms. And finally, we'll wrap up with a choice for the future and what this all means for you and me.
All right, let's jump in. This cultural crisis we're talking about, it isn't just happening by accident. It's being presented as the outcome of a massive conflict, a battle of ideas over what's real, what's good, and what's true.
And what this is really saying is that the real fight isn't person against person or political party against political party. It's a struggle against the ideologies and the belief systems that are shaping our world from behind the scenes. The real conflict is happening down at the roots. So, if we're in a war of ideas, you gotta ask, where are the destructive ones coming from? Well, this particular worldview points to a specific source, a father of lies, whose very nature is to deceive and twist reality. So from this perspective, things like toxic individualism or materialism, they aren't just bad ideas. They're seen as intentional lies designed to lead societies toward destruction.
Now, this is a fascinating quote, especially because of who said it. This comes from Jordan Peterson, a well-known clinical psychologist who used to be an atheist. He said this after visiting the Museum of the Bible, and it really underscores this argument that for a society to even have a concept of truth, it needs a foundational anchor.
And you can see the contrast laid out so clearly here. On one side, you have what are described as hollow and deceptive philosophies, basically ideas built only on human tradition. And on the other side, the alternative, a search for truth and wisdom that's centered on something divine. This really sets the stage for the competing worldviews we're about to break down.
So how do these big, conflicting ideas actually take shape in the real world? Well, they aren't just floating around. They get packaged into these complete, all-encompassing stories about how the world works. We call them worldviews.
Okay, this table is super important because it breaks down 3 of these major stories. First, you've got animism, which says everything is ultimately spiritual. The physical world, it's kind of an illusion. Then there's secularism, the dominant story in the West, which says the exact opposite. Only the physical, material world is real. And then you have biblical theism, which is presented as this integrated story where both the physical and the spiritual are real and interconnected. And just look at how different their answers are for everything, what we are, where we're going, even what resources are.
Let's just zoom in on that idea of resources for a second. The secular story is often described as a closed box. There's only so much stuff to go around, so more people just means less for you. It's a story of scarcity. The biblical story, on the other hand, is seen as an open system. It says the ultimate resource isn't oil or gold, it's human creativity, because we're made in the image of a creative God. The classic example is Singapore, a tiny island with basically no natural resources that became a global economic powerhouse, all through human ingenuity.
So now that we have these competing stories on the table, let's really zoom in on one of them. This section looks at the biblical narrative not just as a religious text, but as a complete story that is proposed as the blueprint for cultural health and human flourishing.
This story has a really clear arc. It kicks off with creation, a good world made with incredible purpose. Then comes rebellion, where things get broken and twisted. That leads to a mission, to bring blessing back to all nations. The story's climax is the cross, which is seen as the decisive victory over evil. This then launches a task for followers to shape entire nations, and it all points toward the return of the king, where history finally reaches its amazing conclusion.
Now, this is a critical point within that story. The Great Commission is often boiled down to just saving individual souls, but the argument here is that it's way bigger than that. It's a call to disciple entire nations, to influence everything from art and science to business and government. And the logic is pretty simple. If the church doesn't disciple the nation will absolutely disciple the church.
And this is the end game, the ultimate vision. It's not a future where every culture gets wiped out and becomes the same. It's a future where the unique, redeemed beauty of every single nation, their art, their music, their glory, is brought together. It means every culture, including Korea's, has a unique and irreplaceable part to play in the final story.
So where did things go wrong? Well, the metaphor used is really powerful. It's like we've torn one chapter, say the gospel, out of this huge, cohesive book. Then we tried to paste that single page into a totally different book, like the book of secularism or Confucianism. And of course it doesn't work. It makes no sense out of context. The call is to get back to reading the whole story from cover to cover.
Okay, so this brings it all down to a really practical level. I mean, it's one thing to talk about these big ideas, but what does it actually look like to live this out? If you adopt this story, how does it change your decisions about your family, your community, and your future?
And this leads to maybe the most pressing question, especially for parents. If the public education system is built on the foundation of a completely different story, a secular one, how on earth do you pass on a faith-based story to your kids? It's a huge, huge challenge.
The proposed solutions are pretty direct, no beating around the bush. They involve finding alternatives, maybe even building new schools from the ground up, or considering things like homeschooling. But what's really emphasized here is that it's not just about teaching kids what to think. It's about teaching them how to think critically, how to analyze every idea they encounter, no matter where it comes from.
Because when you boil it all down, that's what the debate over education is really about. It's a battle over authority. Who has the final say in a child's upbringing and their worldview? Is it the family or is it the state? And your answer to that question reveals which story you're living in.
And that brings us to our final thoughts. We've seen how the deep stories a nation believes directly shape its destiny, its fruit. We've seen how different stories are competing for our hearts and minds. So, the question for each of us is simple, but it's also profound. What story are we choosing to live in right now? And what story will we help write for the future?